Her Majesty, the Queen, has asked me to form a new administration, and I have accepted. It is, of course, the greatest honour that can come to any citizen in a democracy.
Margaret Thatcher arrived at number 10 following the winter of discontent, when trade unionists across industry and the public sector had gone on strike against the then Labour government's pay policy. David, now Lord Owen, was Foreign Secretary in the outgoing Callaghan administration.
It was inevitable after the winter of discontent, when Jim Callaghan wasn't able and decided not to challenge the trade unions. It was inevitable. There was going to be a change, and there was going to have to be a trade union reform. And I think the country knew that. Mrs. Thatcher knew that, although she took quite a time, really, before the full trade union reforms came through. It was not until really after the miners' strike that the issue of the trade unions was settled.
Taking on the unions would mean conflict. Yet on her first day in office, the new Prime Minister appeared to be offering a gentler approach.
I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth.
I had never heard such rubbish.
Brian Walden, the former Labour MP turned television interviewer.
God knows what balmy spin doctor dreamt that one up. She wasn't there to produce harmony at all. She was there to transform the economy and make capitalism work. And she succeeded in doing that, but harmony was the last thing on her mind, and harmony was the last thing she ever produced.
Dr. David Owen says the medicine prescribed by Mrs. Thatcher was harsh but necessary.
She and Geoffrey Howe, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I think he has to be given credit for this, held public expenditure down and saw unemployment rise and became very unpopular. But that was a necessary part of getting resources and investment into economic growth and into new investment in industry. So it was a deliberate attempt to switch the economy away from public sector emphasis and orientation towards a market economy.
The Conservative peer Kenneth Baker rose through the ranks to be party chairman under Margaret Thatcher. He admired her determination to stick to a controversial economic policy even as the going got tough.
The critical budget was the 1981 budget, which, when we were right down in the dumps economically, inflation was soaring, unemployment was very high, Margaret introduced, together with Geoffrey Howe, and I think it was very much her influence, a very tough budget, which was the beginning of the recovery of the economy. That has been, I think, the greatest change in economic management since the war. That also resulted in much greater prosperity for Britain. And if you look at Britain in 1990 compared to 1980, you'll find a much more prosperous country, you'll find a confident country.
Many, though, felt bitterness, accusing her of having a heart of stone. Unfair, she told the faithful at the 1983 Conservative Party conference, a few months after she was returned to power by a landslide.
To have over 3 million people unemployed in this country is bad enough. But to suggest, as some of our opponents have, that we don't care about it is as deeply wounding as it is utterly false.
But Neil Kinnock, by 1983 the Labour leader, says the country paid a high price for her policies.
I know I'm in most respects not objective about Mrs. Thatcher. She was my partisan opponent, and a very fierce one at that. But the facts speak for themselves, and they do demonstrate a fall in investment, an increase in poverty with all of the immense costs that go with that, an increase in the tax burden, great difficulty with the balance of payments, and a huge loss of manufacturing industry.
Some on the left were eager to challenge Mrs. T head-on, especially Arthur Scargill, the new miners' leader. In a bitter 12-month strike over pit closures, there were frequent clashes between pickets and police.
This government will not weaken. This nation will meet that challenge. Democracy will prevail.
Lord Owen, who by 1983 had become leader of the SDP, backed her all the way.
It was an absolutely crucial strike. It had to be won, and it could not end with a draw. This one couldn't end with somehow each side claiming victory. Arthur Scargill actually had to be defeated. If that had not happened, then we would never have had the transformation in industrial relations and the improvement in industrial performance and the overall improvement in our economy that came right through the 90s and is still with us today.
New laws forced unions to ballot their members before strikes and restricted the rights of pickets. But Neil Kinnock says this wasn't why trade unions were weakened.
People say that it was the application of Thatcherism that brought changes in labour market practices and in attitudes towards industrial relations and employment in the United Kingdom. And I guess as a context that probably holds some water. But the biggest, a much more influential change in circumstances was mass unemployment and the monstrous insecurity that went with it. Because if you've got 4 million people in unemployment, you've got 10 million people worrying about their jobs.
Yet to her admirers, she was battling Maggie. And it was a real war, more than anything else, that created this image.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary of State for Defence has just come over to give me some very good news.
The White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. Thank you very much.
What's your reaction? Rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going
Good night,
to declare war
gentlemen.
on Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
The retaking of the Falklands following the Argentine invasion of the islands was a hugely risky enterprise, as Lord Baker recalls.
Of all the prime ministers I've known since Parliament and onward, none of them would have launched a fleet and an army to recover the Falklands. But Margaret was quite determined to do it. Against considerable doubts in her own party, I may say, at the time, but that was remarkable.
The Falklands War thrust Margaret Thatcher to the centre of the international stage, where she worked often in tandem with the American president, right-wing Republican Ronald Reagan. They shared an uncompromising attitude towards Soviet communism. American cruise missiles were stationed here despite mass protests. Neil Kinnock is critical of her closeness to President Reagan.
Unfortunately, the period of Mrs. Thatcher's rule was largely characterized by quite unprecedented deference towards the United States, particularly when Mr. Reagan was the president, contempt almost for the Commonwealth. And then, of course, the attitude towards the European Union meant that there was an opportunity every few months for theatrical grandstanding, which didn't actually win too many friends or influence people.
But, says Brian Walden, winning friends in the European community, as it was then called, was the last thing on her mind.
She loathed Europe, of course. She was myopic about Europe. As far as she was concerned, it was abroad, and therefore she had no European vision. Her vision was of Britain. She wanted Britain as a sovereign, powerful country.
Having won a third election victory in 1987, Margaret Thatcher stepped up the pace of change at home. Nationalised industries were by now being privatised. The city deregulated, Big Bang it was called. Markets were introduced into the public sector. Professor John Gray of the London School of Economics was a leading commentator on Thatcherism, an ideology, he says, which barely existed in 1979, even in Margaret Thatcher's own mind.
She began simply by wanting to curb union power and restore certain aspects of balanced budgets, Victorian public housekeeping, you might say, in public expenditure. She had relatively limited goals, and it was only by towards the end of the 80s, in fact, that she became something like a revolutionary of the right, trying to transform British society.
But by the late 80s, many Conservatives were asking where the revolution was taking them. The poll tax, a political disaster, alienated even Tory voters. But it was Europe which gave her opponents their chance.
No, no, no.
Her unbending opposition to further moves towards European integration in October 1990 forced the resignation of Sir Geoffrey Howe. Michael Heseltine, who'd walked out of the cabinet, literally, during the Westland crisis, threw down the gauntlet. David Owen could see the end coming.
The last 2 years of her prime ministership, she was too autocratic, she wasn't listening, she thought she knew it all, and she was getting more and more alienated from her party. And as always happens under a system, the party reasserted and Parliament reasserted control over a prime minister who was out of control.
Margaret Thatcher, beloved of the party faithful, had made too many enemies among her Conservative colleagues in Parliament. While Kenneth Baker, who became her Education Secretary, seemed invigorated by rowing with her, Others were bruised by the experience.
Oh, on education, we had tremendous debates. All of my colleagues will tell you. After the election of '87, we were trying to formulate the national curriculum. There were tremendously acrimonious debates, because Margaret wanted a very simple curriculum of English, maths and science, and I wanted a much bigger one, more complex one of other subjects. And there were very rough words said over the cabinet table. But Margaret didn't mind an argument if you argued strongly with her. But if you hadn't got your facts right, I've seen her pulverise ministers, absolutely pulverise them.
Although she beat Michael Heseltine in the first ballot of the leadership contest, the margin was too narrow to prevent a second round. It was over.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11.5 wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11.5 years ago.
Her strong points were her iron will. I'd never known a will like it in politics, and I've known a few politicians in my time. I've never known a man or woman faintly like her. She was as tough as they come, and anything that required guts and will, she could do for you. Anything that required sensitivity, she couldn't. She had none.
Brian Walden interviewed her many times. He enjoyed it, he says, because, unlike some politicians, she actually answered the questions. Two former opposition party leaders, Neil Kinnock and David Owen, differ markedly on what she actually achieved in office.
I regret to have to say this. I would love to be able to allocate some credit over an extended and in some ways distinguished period of office by Britain's first woman Prime Minister. But I'd just be dishonest if I was to try, even with the benefit of hindsight, to say that there was something fundamentally beneficial and fundamentally progressive and advantageous from that period. I can't convince myself on objective grounds that that was the case.
I think that her greatness must lie in understanding that we had to have a market economy, we had to reform our industrial relations, and it's an economic record which overall was extremely successful and very necessary and rather painful.
The academic John Gray has this thought, that Margaret Thatcher's success in changing Britain created the sort of society which, in many respects, she never really wanted.
As she herself said, she did in fact change everything in Britain, but not in the way that she wanted. She made Britain a society that she herself could barely recognise, a highly fragmented, individualistic society, heavily and deeply globalised, not terribly cohesive. The kind of stuffy, slightly stodgy 1950s Britain she wanted to revive was consigned to the memory hole of history forever by the very free market she'd brought into being.
Love her or loathe her, it's hard to think of any other peacetime Prime Minister in the 20th century who had quite the same impact as Margaret Thatcher.